I think we have a couple people, just two people missing, but I didn't want to hold us up, so I will send the agenda now. And guess we'll give it a second. So did you guys get a chance to review the meeting minutes? I hope I sent them. Yeah. So did you guys get a chance to review the meeting minutes? Do they look okay?
Yeah, I thought they looked fine. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to do that new structure with the action items. I'm finding that that's been pretty helpful with the other subcommittees in terms of tracking things that we could potentially work on. So I just wanted to know if you guys found that to be okay, or if you guys also have any edits. No. Okay, cool.
Would you
Cool.
like a motion to approve the minutes as presented?
Yes.
Move it to approve the minutes as presented.
All right. Can I get a second?
Second.
Great. Thank you guys. Okay, so the next thing that I have here is an Article 80 and Squares and Streets update. But Chelsea's on the call. She's sick, but she might be able to provide a little bit more information on Squares and Streets because I was out the day that they met with us. They did send along the information, but she might be able to talk a little bit more about that. So
Yep.
we can start with Article 80 and then you can jump in on Squares and Street.
Okay.
On Squares. Yeah, so the Article 80, they have a modernization draft plan, so it was for internal review. And they sent it to the Office of Historic Preservation for us to be able to give some feedback. So while I don't think that I'm able to share the plan with you, I did want to give some I did want to let you guys know the feedback that we gave them. So, in terms of the CATs replacing the IAGs, there was a section that talked about how they are thinking about selecting members of that group, and I added that there should be somebody from the Office of Historic Preservation to be part of that selection staff, so that they can review the people who will be part of that team. And at one point, I think that the Article 80 modernization draft did discuss historical and cultural assets, and Joe Cornish flagged and asked the question how that would be measured. And so I, took from our conversations and I said that our subcommittee has been having conversations around the CARE tool, and to compare carbon impacts in renovating an existing building versus replacing it. And it's a good way to intersect that climate impact and historical cultural value lost with demolition. And then I also talked about cultural asset mapping as a way to measure cultural impact. And then I said that a larger historical and cultural resource survey would be needed. And then let's see what else. So they have a section on required disclosures. And I made sure to ask when those required disclosures could go out, because to the public, I should say, because I said considering that residents might want to or need to utilize Article 85, how early in the process are they going to be notified in terms of this required disclosure process they're trying to implement, so that residents and people of the public can move on Article 85 very early on, so additional work isn't taken on by the developer before Article 85 is triggered. And they have this they're trying to create a determination process in the early steps that will talk about the adequacy of the project. And I stated that it makes sense for there to be coordination with the Office of Historic Preservation and Article 85 to happen during that time. That planning department staff is reviewing conceptual designing and preparing feedback. So essentially, I stated that Article 85 and OHP should be engaged in step 1, or step 2 of that determination process. And then I asked how will the Office of Historic Preservation or this this group that the Office of Historic Preservation might be a part of, how will it interact with CATs as CATs are formed and take on a life of their own. And then Chelsea, I can go into some of your comments and then you can talk about squares and streets. So she said overall, she would like to know more about how OHP fits into the document, instead of, just specific moments of preservation fits here, more about how overall the planning department is thinking about historic preservation. She talked about standards. She said requiring proponents to file a new disclosure on displacements and demolition impacts. And that's in response to an effort to standardize mitigation and community benefits. Same thing. For the planning department, when they're conducting new planning efforts, Chelsea added that they should be considering historic preservation through historic research surveys ahead of time. And she also, of course, added that this type of work can add into and can be part of that historic and cultural resource survey that we would like to have. So that's Article 80 updates.
I'm gonna add something to that that I probably didn't write, and I think Joe and I might have made an assumption that was wrong when we were reading it, but we assumed when reading it that we would be part of the planning staff that they're talking about, because we've been told for many years that we're moving to the planning department and it never happens. When Brian Sweat came on board, he mentioned that that was a thing that might happen. And then we haven't really heard anything else about it since then. But so I guess my comments were before I had kind of read it through that lens. And then Joe and I were saying, well, we need to be part of every part about this. Like historic preservation should be like in every step of their new plan. And he said, oh, I think we are. I think we're going to be in the planning stuff. I think we're going to be considered planning stuff. So I think in order to like, that's what Joe responded to them. And I don't know if we're ever going to get like a concrete answer there, but I guess just, I would say that that's what he had assumed, and that kind of makes sense, but I'm not sure if we're right or wrong. Go ahead, Allison.
Well, first, thank you, Hennessy and Chelsea, for advocating for preservation at this point. And Chelsea, I hope you feel better. Thanks for being here, even though you're not feeling well.
I'm actually on the mend. I had COVID all of that, but I'm better today, and I think I'm even going to go into the office tomorrow. So it's very exciting. I've been alone.
I'm sorry. I guess I have some questions. If you guys, I'd like to understand a little bit more about what you learned about the cats. And then when the public will get a chance to see this draft that you guys got to see and respond to it. But I guess to your point you just made, Chelsea, on the planning staff, there are, urban design staff that are engaged, as far as I can tell, with every project. There's at least one assigned, and they're reviewing the project all the way through. Do you anticipate OHP staff serving that role? Is that what you were asking for or hoping for, that you'd have staff that would be part of the design or review team for these projects along with planning, and you would be actively involved every step of the way?
Yes.
Do you have the staff for that right now? Is it just you?
It's me. I mean, we could probably break it down by, there's also, maybe there's like a part of the, I mean, maybe there's part of the statement of when we get involved is like, it has to affect some type of historic or cultural resource. I don't know. I don't know how they would like quantify it, but I am sort of doing this work already. By sort of trying to catch up with Article 80 stuff that I learn about. And I'm sure I'm not doing it in a holistic way, but I am going to a ton of Article 80 meetings and, kind of doing what I just said. But, maybe I could be underestimating what kind of staff it would take. That's a good point.
Well, I mean, I definitely think this should be formalized in the process. Like it should
Yeah.
be expected and required that you, and I would assume additional use would be, just like the planning staff would be assigned to every project and be part of it all along the way. Now, there may be some that don't impact historic resources really at all that you maybe are less relevant on, but you should have the opportunity to weigh in and make that decision for yourselves, and not be relegated to some small part of the process, because none of the other professionals are, come in at a particular moment. Those design staff are there for the whole thing. And I think you should be too, if you think it's relevant.
Yeah. I mean, we're finding it very helpful to be part of things that we're part of right now. Cause like, for instance, there was a Article 80 that got flagged for me that has like one of the oldest houses in Boston on the site, and they were planning to demolish it. So with my involvement, I'm trying to do this work already. But yes, it should be formalized, and we should be told as to whether we're going to be part of the planning staff or not, moving forward.
Yeah, and right now, like I really rely on certain individuals like Alexa and Megan, who are part of the process.
Right.
But we can't guarantee that there'll always be preservation-minded people in those roles. And so we need a guarantee that there will be an OHP staff person involved, with every project as they feel appropriate.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's definitely what Joe was stating to me. So, I hope, I'll clarify with him just to make sure that he's gotten some confirmation on that, but we definitely need to be there.
Chelsea, if you want to talk a little bit about, if anybody has comments, but if you want to talk a little bit about squares and streets.
Yeah. So funny. I think I might have a little dyslexia because I always call it streets and squares. I don't know why, but I do. So yeah. So I think I can't remember what we've talked about with this group, but I think you're aware that we had asked them to survey all of the areas that they were considering for their program. And they came back and said, no, we're not going to survey them. We can't afford that. But we are going to do these things called, what do they call them, Hennessy? Like historic resource studies or something like that. I don't remember what they're called, but anyway.
I know they were doing some cultural mapping. Is that what you're talking about? Is that something different?
That might be a little bit different. Oh, you're muted, Hennessy.
They're calling them historical context studies.
Okay.
It's supposed to describe socioeconomic histories of the area and how the built environment evolved in response, identify key historic buildings and areas, both extant and non-extant. And historical context studies will form the basis of a future update to the area forms,
Right.
including an updated inventory of historic structures.
Right. So we didn't get what we really wanted, which was actual survey work done. Because they said it would take too long and be too expensive. And we got these summaries instead, which got, leased out to good consultants who know what they're doing. And we got the first one back, I think yesterday, and I have not read it in full yet, but it's the one for Roslindale Square, and it is 40 pages long, I think. So I don't know if I'm allowed to share that. I don't think so because it's a draft, but I can find out, or I can I think that we're supposed to get our comments back to them at a certain point next week, so I'll ask. Anyway, I haven't read it yet, so I don't know how useful they're gonna be. My sense is that for like when we're trying to like, I always put it in terms of like, well, how is this gonna help me in an argument? Right? Like, because I'm gonna argue to save something and they're gonna say, oh no, it isn't surveyed, it isn't important, it isn't, you know, all that stuff. So I'm trying to figure out like how these summaries will actually help us in our office. I'm assuming they will. It seems like they're meant to. But definitely it falls short of an actual survey. And then I said, what else did I say? So that's the first one. So, and the other ones are in progress. The other areas that are already started, which I think it's one other one in Hennessy, I think.
I think so.
I don't know what one it is. I kind of have lost track a little bit, but anyway, so that's what they have, that's what the planning department has offered to us as like a way to participate in Squares and Streets. I have been getting invited to meetings about projects, but then sometimes I haven't been. So yeah, I think it is risky as well. Who are they being done by? I forget who the consultant was for the Roslindale one, but maybe PAL. I think it could be PAL. And yeah, they're not good enough. Like we are, you know, we know that, and we told them that. We said that it's not the same as having an actual like survey that we can look at a rating on. But they said it was too expensive, and you know how that goes. So all the more reason for us to push forward with our other work. I don't know if I have any more updates on that. Can you think of any, Hennessy?
No, I mean, I think that's the gist of it. They are have gone through their first rounds of phases, and I think they're working on Rosendale now. It was great that they were able to meet with us. I think that we were able to provide some feedback. You know, it's definitely potentially good to talk about it here because we can work on it in our memo to really think through some of the suggestions that we want to come out of this. Allison.
Well, thanks. I just want to go back to the cats real quick before we moved on though. Last I heard they didn't know yet if they were gonna do geographical cats or like building type cats. Have they clarified that at all?
Yeah, I think they are doing geographical. What I reviewed, it seems like they're really thinking thoroughly, at least about how they want the process to work for how they pick it, and how long somebody stays on cats. So they are setting some standards for term limits, for diversity, and for some training so that people who are part of cats have some background. Also, again, with the group of people that are able to pick them. And I think that so I think they are working through that, and they are doing it I think they're doing, instead of one individual project, they're doing whatever amount of projects per geographical location.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I
Here's
guess
what
that makes sense. Sorry, I don't know. I had to cut somebody off, sorry.
No.
But I did I was gonna ask, they had talked about having professionals on the cats representing different, you know, fields. And I was encouraged by that because I thought maybe we could have a preservation professional on each cat. Is that still on the table?
Yes, it is still on the table. They're thinking potentially having somebody like neighborhood groups, community experts, and professional experts, which I would assume that would probably be like planners, historic preservationists. So I do think that's still part of their thought process for structure.
Yeah, I do too.
Amanda?
I'm just wondering if the Office of Historic Preservation was able to review the RFP that went out in order to hire the
No, we weren't.
historical context study. Okay. And
No.
then what about oversight into work product at all? Were there any sort of steps where you could sit down and review a draft before it was like finalized?
Nope, we were given a pretty final, I mean, I think our comments will be taken into account, but we were given a pretty final document to look at.
So maybe those are, now that we've got this sort of first example, maybe we can make larger comments on, okay, the next time we do this historical, what are they calling it? Historical context studies,
Yep.
we'd like to see some work product, halfway through or at different gates, and also maybe revise the RFP to reflect more of what we'd like to see
Right.
in the final study.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. Then again, I think I don't know if they've awarded all the contracts already, but I'm just not sure how their structure has worked in terms of hiring them.
Yeah, that'd be great if we could kind of catch that now before it gets too far down the road. There's always going to be more, if this is sort of the structure that they like to move forward, there's going to be, 9 and 10 and 12 down the road. So.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Well, Powell is a pretty well-respected firm. And honestly, I'm not surprised that they couldn't add comprehensive historic resource surveys into their scope. I think we need to keep pushing for that. We need to I would prefer, again, rather than doing it neighborhood here, neighborhood there, one comprehensive citywide survey, all using the same platform, the same approach,
Yep.
and have it be one unified effort. That's what we've really been lacking for years. We need the money for that. So I'm glad that we've got something out of these studies, but I'm not surprised we didn't get that.
Yeah, we were hoping for at least area study, but did not happen. Yeah, so that's as far as, I think that's all we know about streets and squares and streets.
Well, so how do you guys feel about it overall? What you saw from the Article 80 update and the squares and streets, do you feel like preservation is being taken seriously, or are we off to the side again?
I think we're pretty far off to the side, unless we are being considered part of the planning staff. That's what we really need clarified. But if we're not, I would say we're pretty much, off to the side.
Yeah, I would say that I think people are trying to engage with historic preservation, but ultimately it's like an institutional process. So if it's not a more concerted effort of getting the historic preservation department involved in everything that gets done, then I think it's a valiant effort, but it's not necessarily going to last long, or it's not going to be well thought out. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually been really nice to have Alexa as the ED because she's so good at including us in things now. Because we're like obviously on the top of her mind. But at some point we will have an ED who won't be sitting in the planning department, and I think that'll be, it'll be a little bit more difficult to get a seat at the table at that time. I mean, I hope that's not true, but it might be. And even when we have a seat at the table, we're sort of not, I don't know. I guess I could use an example to explain what I'm trying to say. The project that involves the older house I was mentioning that was proposed for demo, it's the Clapp Fields house in Fields Corner, which got moved off of its original site and moved backwards on the original lot. So right now it's like in a parking lot behind Fields Corner. Like if you go to the bank, you might park there. And you know, a developer came in with a ready-made package that had already been through some amount of Article 80 review, where they were demolishing that structure and building an addition right on top of it. And so when I arrived on the scene, I said, this is insane. Why can't we just put the addition on the other side of the lot and, you know, preserve the building and use the building and things like that. And I actually, another planning staff member and I did like some charrettes and we did drawings and we did everything to like show how you could save this really quite easily. And it just sort of fell on deaf ears. It was like, oh, who's this person at the table telling us that we can't do what we want to do? So, and like the result of that is still unknown. I mean, I made a very clear statement that we would not be demolishing or moving that building, but I don't know how far my statements carry. Allison?
Well, I just want to say this really reflects an equity and class divide issue that is sort of in depth, it's embedded at City Hall from decades ago that downtown neighborhoods are historic and these squares and street locations don't meet that standard or something. And it's really an equity issue that really troubles me. I'm sorry. It's
Yeah,
because
no. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yep.
I just wanted to say that.
Yeah. So eventually, I don't know how fast Fields Corner is going to become an official Squares and Streets project, but that project will get folded into that Squares and Streets thing eventually, Fields Corner. So I'm sure we'll all get a look at it at a certain point.
Allison?
So Chelsea, I think that could be a really interesting case study because I think I know what you're talking about. It's, I mean, to look at it, you wouldn't realize there was a whole lot going on there. I think that it's a harder argument, I think, for that building because the general public doesn't see anything but an old building. So as we are making recommendations for Article 80, even if we have a seat at the table, if there's no requirements to keep a building because of historic significance, even if we can prove historic significance, we need another avenue. Like we're going to talk about Article 85 and we want to extend the delay, but that might not even be effective in the end. And that's why I would hope we would talk more about using the environmental aspect in Article 80 and making them prove why it's best environmentally as well as culturally and from an affordability aspect to tear down a building and replace it. Like that should be the very first thing they do before they do any drawings or invest any time in the project. They need to do an analysis of these criteria of why this concept that they want to do is better than reusing the building that's there. And preservation should be part of that analysis, but the care tool and environmental and waste, debris, all of that should be calculated and presented to the public. And they need to prove why their project is better than alternatives that keep the existing building.
Yeah, and I made the recommendation, so I hope that they, look into it a little bit more and then try to incorporate that into their work. But yeah, I agree. Other than, so we can start talking about Article 85 now and transition over to that. But
Well,
unless
so we are working, the goal from this subcommittee is to do formal recommendations on Article 80, Article 85, and then other aspects like demolition by neglect, things like that. We're getting ready to lose a building that I've been trying to save for over a decade because of demolition by neglect. So I'd like to have a really comprehensive memo on our recommendations in all of these areas and how they'll play out in these different processes. But I'd like, so we're gonna keep working on some draft language for these memos for everybody to respond to, but as we're having this conversation, any thoughts on if we drafted language to that end where all of these things should be analyzed at the very beginning of Article 80 and made public for public comment before a project? Because the process now, as I'm sure you guys know, they don't consider reusing the building in any formal way, and they present these really shiny renderings of their new project to the public. And they say, we're going to have this many units, and we're going to improve the sidewalks, and we're going to add trees. And look at, you don't want this old building, you want this shiny new project. And it's not presented fairly. They're not presenting alternatives early on in the process. That doesn't come until Article 85, and it's not even a real effort, a genuine effort to present alternatives or consider them. We need that to happen at the beginning of Article 80 if it's going to be taken seriously. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, about what all we want them to be required to review and present to the public, what criteria. Has anybody thought about that or have opinions?
I would say that the draft of what I saw did not have that type of disclosure up front. Is that true, Hennessy?
Oh, sorry, sorry. Yeah, I mean, I would say so. I think some considerations are there, but I don't think it's enough.
Okay, yeah. So in terms of like the document that we were allowed to look at so far, and by the way, we were given like 2 days to return comments, so it wasn't very useful, but we can still return more comments. I think that our memo should address that definitely. But just in terms of like what this committee is working on, I think definitely the timing is good because it's still in a draft form.
I think that the default has always been that the developer gets to choose what happens at a site. And maybe there's some zoning, maybe there's some language in an NDOD that they're supposed to address, but ultimately they get to decide what's best for that site. And then the public gets to maybe tweak it, but we don't get to have a full analysis of what is actually best for that site, given all of the options. And I would like to have a process that's more, what are the options on the site and what is the best thing for the community, for walkability, the environment, affordability, everything. And the developer designs that. And I know that that's different, but I think that's would get us better results. So how do we build that in?
Are there models for that from other cities? Are there good models of developers doing that sort of alternatives analysis that we can point to as precedent or effective or any of those good things?
So good question. I'm not sure, but I can dig around a little bit.
I wonder if the National Trust used to have sort of a network of statewide and local preservation nonprofits. I wonder if any of them might have experiences that they would be able to share and the is basically zoning code language to go with it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, the most successful examples that I can think of, are the ones where Historic Boston is involved from the start. And so they obviously develop buildings in a much different way than a normal developer. And I'm sure there's others. I just can't think of them right now.
Right, but I think the difference of a preservation organization figuring out a development versus a commercial developer doing the kind of alternatives analysis that Allison's envisioning. It's interesting. I mean, from a planning perspective, one could imagine a situation where the zoning code says, we as a city have identified what this community wants in this place. It's consistent with overall goals for the city. What can you propose that meets that criteria? More traditional understanding of zoning. But you're right, that's not really the way Boston has done it in
No.
practice. And I guess if we are looking for, I mean, developers have a profit motive, right? They want to present the thing that will make them the most money the best. And so anything that a developer is presenting is going to, the pictures are going to be the prettiest for the ones that make the most money. And the ones that they don't want to build will always look a little less stellar. So I think it's that question of how do we
And who writes
get in
them?
early enough in the conversation, and are there good models from other communities where developers have this obligation and are actually meeting it and it's informative and useful.
Yeah, I agree. I think it merits doing some research into other similar cities to see if they have anything in their zoning code, as you said, or if they just have any materials, documents, studies that we can look into to see how they addressed, you know, not demolishing buildings and the historic preservation. So that's one thing I'll put that on my to-do list to look into.
So I think squares and streets, the goal of it is to get at that, where we've identified in advance, I mean, hypothetically, working with the community. In this part of the neighborhood, we want housing and we want this percentage to be affordable and we want roughly this density with this height limit and we want roughly this setback and whatever. All that stuff we talked about in squares and streets and in design vision. So if you're following that, we have an outline of what we want. Design vision citywide, of course, squares and streets is sort of little pockets, but still. What I think it doesn't address is existing buildings, because as long as you check those boxes, yes, I'm building housing, and yes, I'm building this height, then you're good to go. What I haven't really seen addressed is there's a building already on the site. How do we say you need to look at reusing that building first, or adding on to it, improving it, upgrading it, whatever. But the first thing you do is look at how to use that building that's there. And then if there just aren't any options, then we move to deconstruction and salvage. And then we move into a new design concept. That's the piece I feel like through design vision and squares and streets and Article 80 that I haven't really seen addressed. And again, it's not just from a preservation perspective, it's from an environmental perspective, an affordability perspective, walkability, everything points to reusing what's there. In many cases, but nothing is seeming to enforce that from a regulatory perspective.
I'll add, so in Plan Charlestown, which is a few months back now, so I'll probably get the language incorrect, but there's a clause somewhere. It's a real sort of high level sort of goal that basically states that in order for Article 80 projects to be approved in Charlestown in specific areas, they must have a preservation component included in it in order to get like additional allowances for things like FAR. So that was sort of our, way of tying in preservation to like the larger process. So I'm not sure if there's an easier or more sort of specific way to, again, part of it is changing hearts and minds from, planning and priorities of the city, to justify what we're asking for. But maybe it's just sort of a high level statement that said, that says this is a priority for Boston for these reasons. And, anything on this site must or shall, or, whatever the language is, shall be like default preserved, right? For these reasons, that kind of thing. So maybe it's a higher level, again, it's just stating, what the intentions are, whether it's going to actually come to fruition, it's a whole nother conversation, but we were able to get that written into Plan Charlestown, so it could work in a different form on these things possibly.
Yeah, I think design vision would have been where that high level thinking would have gone. And I do think there was a lot of great stuff in design vision, but it didn't go quite that far. As far as I recall, of insisting that buildings be reused if at all possible. But to Margaret's point, developers are going to do what's best for developers. So if that means tearing a building down and building something twice as big, that's what they're going to do, unless there's a regulatory restriction against it. The city is upzoning, whether it's through Plan Downtown, Plan Charlestown, Squares and Streets, we are upzoning the city. So they're making room for more height. And what that means is that the value transfers from the existing building to the land. And that means that it's more profitable to tear down what's there, to disinvest in it, so that you can build bigger. So we're going to see more buildings being lost. We're going to see more deferred maintenance, more demolition by neglect, and more demolition for new construction when we upzone. That's just the consequence of it. So I think, again, we have to put language in Article 80 that says before you invest a lot of time in your new design, you have to prove why this is the right thing to do. For example, there's a proposal, it's just an LOI at this point, but in the Bullfinch Triangle near TD Garden, there's a block, it's 3 or 4 buildings. And the proposal is to demolish them all and build something big. And while I'm sure the housing or hotel or whatever it's going to be will be wonderful, those are all perfectly good buildings. There's no reason to send them all to a landfill. And I think if the city were looking at it through that lens, then nobody would even propose that. Now, from a preservation lens, the argument's a little bit harder, because I don't know, I haven't done a lot of research yet, but that any of those buildings have particular historic significance. So that's why I feel like if this conversation is relegated to just Article 85, we're going to keep losing stuff. If it's an environmental conversation and we're looking for facts, not just opinions. Do we think this is historic? Do we think this is the right thing to do? We need facts, and that's where I think the calculator comes in, the CARE tool, and other parameters that I don't quite know yet of how to analyze whether it's the right demolition is the right thing for the city overall.
So, I mean, I'm just sort of trying to articulate this, and this is not a fully thought through concept. It reminds me of some of the conversations around displacement, which I think we are having, which is if, by asking developers to look at, we understand that you're looking at this place here and you're looking at it at this place here, but what happens in between? And in effect, almost the similar conversations about displacing people you could have about displacing places. That the fact that there's a place that exists and there'll be a place that exists in the future doesn't deal with or there's a resident who exists and there's a resident who will exist in the future. That doesn't deal with the quality of those places and the meaning of those places and the experience of those places and the people who are connected to them. So again, I'm really at the beginning of thinking this way. But I feel like there may be, in the same way, city council was asking for consideration of displacement and concerns about displacement to be addressed early on. That community impact, that environmental impact, and that preservation impact might be part of that same conversation and analysis. I'm glad Hennessy is nodding because, again, I'm just beginning to think this way, so I don't know if it's crazy or not, but it seems like it's a similar kind of set of concerns.
Margaret, that's
Oh.
exactly what we've got to figure out here is how do we quantify that? I think as preservationists, we understand that there's value in an existing building. There's value in the materials and the craftsmanship and the stories and memories associated with it. How do we quantify that in a way that there could be an analysis that says, there's all this great stuff in this old building, but there's also all this great stuff in this new building. It's going to have bicycle parking, which the old building didn't have, and whatever else. How do we measure that? If we're going to require developers to do that analysis, what is it exactly that they're putting in their report that we can say, compare these two proposals, keeping and adding on to the old building versus brand new building? That's what we have to figure out is what is exactly are they going to be putting in that report for the public to respond to?
I haven't gotten quite that far, I think.
That's what we need to think about. Some things we can calculate. The CARE tool, and there's other tools like it, can give us an analysis of embodied carbon. We can have them calculate how many tons of material would go to a landfill if they're going to demolish, and how much construction waste would go to the landfill with the new construction. There's some things that are quantifiable, but historic preservation is inherently a little bit more nuanced and intangible. So how do we do that?
And I think we're sort of coming at the same thing from two different perspectives. I'm maybe thinking more about how do we make the case that this deserves to be part of the earliest analysis of how spaces in this city are used. That's one piece of it. And then you make the excellent point that we also have to say, and these are the criteria by which that analysis will be judged, or these are the things that you need to address. Because for a very long time, and still today, the people who actually live in our communities are sometimes seen as temporary and disposable. And the places in our communities can be treated the same way. So you are absolutely right that that criteria needs to exist, but I think we also need to make the case and frame the argument that these values need to be you need to engage with those early on. And I think, given what Chelsea has said today, that the policy memo, for lack of a better term, should also say there's sort of one track if historic preservation is an important part of the planning department of the city of Boston. And there's another track if it remains an independent department. And how those two things happen, that ideally it would happen more organically for all in the same department. But, for the longest time, the BRA had, one landscape architect. And so they were addressing open space issues, but it wasn't staffed at the same level as other things that were priorities. So Allison, I really appreciate you flagging the fact that staffing is going to be key.
Yeah.
Adequate provision for professionals in the city to do the work that they are being asked to do for the people of the city needs to happen.
Absolutely. And for what it's worth, I asked Chief Sweat directly if he thought that OHP would be moving to the planning department. And my sense was that it's not high on the priority list anytime soon. So I think we need to expect it's going to stay under environment for the time being and plan around that.
Yeah, I think so too. And I find that incredibly frustrating, but I think that's what he prefers for now. Not sure why, but so I think that's what we should plan for. I think that we get a draft memo to him sooner than later, because he doesn't really know what we're doing. I mean, he does, but I don't think he knows that we have sort of like concrete steps in mind. And I'd like to garner support sooner than later, because without it, we're not going to go very far.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, I think it's about time. I think we know what we want, or we know at least what we would like to see. And so I think that talking through this, getting something on paper and having us review it and then sending it out, I think it'll be at least helpful in that there's something tangible for people to react to, and for people to be held accountable to, and that it's coming from the Commemoration Commission, which is charged with making sure that these things are different. So I think it'll be helpful in some sense. So I think we can definitely keep talking about it. I'm taking notes about everything that we're saying so that I can, put some action items on my plate. I think I'm thinking about what Margaret was saying so that I can review potentially some similar cities to see what they're doing. And and cultural asset mapping, to if that's helpful, how that might help us at some point in the future. So I mean, that's one thing. I know on our agenda it talks about future meeting topics. And that's just because I wanted us to, have some stuff planned going forward so that we feel like we're getting work done. So I can assume potentially that our next meeting will be to review that memo once there's something written down there. And then, following meetings can discuss, we've been talking about cultural districts, but we haven't given it a proper session. So we could potentially talk about cultural districts, and what we can do and how we can work with cultural districts. I can always invite MAPC. They've reached out to me. I've met with them a little while ago. So I think it's always a good option to talk about if we want to, discuss that, cultural districts and cultural asset mapping a little bit further. But I wanted to open it up to you guys to see what other topics you guys think make sense to start introducing or bringing back.
Yeah, I definitely second the cultural. I think it's not just cultural districts, but it's sort of like, how do cultural assets become a part of our historic districts and what's considered historic. And I was thinking about, well, I'm really sorry it was late, but I jumped into a really good conversation, and I was thinking about, yeah, it's like, it's not just building by building that we want to be looking at, displacement impact, environmental impact, and, historic preservation impact, but it's also, what's the impact, in the same way that now we're requiring developers to do a fair housing analysis, to analyze, like, what's their impact on fair housing, in this neighborhood. And that's not just supposed to mean like, did you directly displace people on this site? But, how is that affecting the whole community? In a similar way, we could say, like, well, what's the impact on the historic preservation of this neighborhood, you know, as a whole. And I think that would have to look not just at historic buildings, but also at this kind of cultural assets as well.
I agree. I mean, I think even because I was on the MAPC website and they were defining what they see as like cultural assets, you know, and it was like art galleries, movie theaters, blah blah blah. And I'm thinking it depends on the neighborhood and and the community that's there,
Mm.
but you know, murals are part of that.
Mhm.
I remember when the Roxbury Love mural came down, it was a
Mm.
huge issue. And
Mhm.
I mean, they might not consider that significant if and so my thing is that we have to even flag how the work is analyzed or what is analyzed and through which lenses they're being analyzed, because you can go into a community with the best of intentions and then miss what is culturally important even when you're doing that asset mapping. So, you know, it'll be important to at some point discuss and think through how best are we engaging the community when we're using those tools and using those
Mm.
and using that infrastructure, because if we just use the infrastructure to analyze it and we're not really engaging with the community in that process, we might still miss um what exactly they find valuable and historic, and you know, and also potentially us having a conversation about what is Boston taking as a historical thing and what is it taking as a cultural thing, and what's the difference and why.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
maybe
so
You
we
know-
definitely have a core of people in Chinatown that are digging into this conversation. If we put this on the agenda, I'd like to invite some, you know, we've been working with MAPC on a cultural plan for Chinatown. And, you know, the first thing we did is to say, to us, a cultural plan, it's not just about the arts, you know, as we define them. It's about like, we want to have our live chicken stores. We want to have our herbal stores, you know, we want to keep, you know, hearing people speaking, you know, in our, you know, the homeland dialects on the street, you know, so how do you capture stuff like that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's very important to include, you know, just the fact that, you know, older businesses house mom and pop shops, right? Like that's the culture of an area. And you replace that with a brand new building. Well, now you're going to get a CVS, right? So it's just different. It's displacement. That's exactly, you know, what Margaret's talking to on like so many different levels, right? It's displacement of affordability and legacy businesses and all of that. So I think it's all one and the same, and we have to keep, you know, weaving those conversations into historic preservation and not try to separate them into cultural preservation and historic preservation.
Mm. Can you guys hear me? I
Yep.
switched to, okay. I just want to note that CPA is actually doing a good job of recognizing things like this. Or I don't know if they're doing a good job, but I can think of a good example of a project that they funded that it got historic preservation funding money, not in a particularly historic building, but it was some type of like Jamaican social club, I think in Roxbury, and it was just great that they got that money to fix their building. It was for the building because it needed repointing and things like that. But I mean, I think so many people in Boston are kind of already thinking this way. So we could look at what their criteria are too.
The only thing that this conversation is making me think is, as much as we all smile and nod when Pal is the consultant, I think one of the challenges will be that traditionally historic preservation consultants come out of this mindset of, we don't evaluate use. We evaluate structure. That historic preservations in that traditional training is about the structures and not about the uses. And that we should evaluate significance based on the structures and not the uses. Whether a building was a factory and is now housing is not is not seen as in quite the same way. So I think one of the questions will also be in terms of the consulting teams who will help evaluate these, and it sounds like Chinatown may have some best practices that could be used as a model. Or is developing testing, so, or wants to be, like who those consultants are and how those contracts are written and how that's evaluated. I think for people who've been brought up in that very architecturally defined historic preservation mindset, this is a different set of evaluative criteria. Not 100% true, certainly not true of the preservation advocacy community, but from a National Register criteria kind of mindset, Secretary of Interior standards, that's where a lot of that consultant community, that's their bread and butter.
I was in the same headspace, Margaret, because again, going back to, we're gonna have to have set parameters if we're putting this into Article 80. There's gonna have to be criteria and specific things that we're asking them to analyze. And the default is gonna be National Register, Secretary of the Interior standards, if we don't redefine that ourselves. And one example that sort of lives in the back of my mind is, you remember the Henry Hampton House in Roxbury, and it behind the house was being preserved by the owner, and the landscape too, all of that was understood to be historic, but behind that were some concrete block garages, and we used our historic preservation checklist, and we're like, well, we don't think they're significant, we're not going to advocate for them. And looking back, I think that was the wrong decision, because they held value for the neighborhood and they were associated with the site. And so I think, to your point, we needed to collectively define what that criteria is going to be and who gets to make that decision, who gets to decide where there's value. I don't think we should leave it up to people that are not part of this, preservation culture community or some checkbox. It needs to have a broader definition and be more inclusive.
Yeah, I was
I
thinking, sorry, Chelsea, go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry, go ahead. Hennessy, again, I read it like 2 weeks ago and have been sick. So I think there was some amount of like cultural resource awareness in the Article 80 planning document.
But what teeth did they give it? I mean, it's one thing to say you need to take it into consideration.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'll have to look over it again. If there is any part of it that definitely points to what we're saying, I'll call it out. But I feel like there was a little bit of that in it. Maybe it was in the way that people were chosen for the, what are they called?
Cats.
Caps. Cats. So I'll look at that again just to see if they picked up on some of the things that we've been saying. Because I think, yeah, you're right. If we get a citywide survey, we're not necessarily going to get a consultant who can do both, or many consultants who can do both. It's going to have to be an overlap survey.
I mean, I think that Article 80 plan, it talked about that community members have been discussing concerns around cultural enterprises, and that they would like to assess cultural displacement impacts. But and so those are some of the questions: what developers, what historic, cultural, or art assets exist on a site. So that's but that's basically it. I think that they discuss it, and their intent is, okay, we're gonna see what cultural impacts there are, but there's nothing that really fleshes out how they're going to assess cultural impact, or how development will displace culture. So that is something to note. And the other thing I wanted to say, as soon as, Chelsea discussed, CPA funding that community center, I want to read into it and see what exactly they wrote about and how they wrote about it, to see if that's, what they did and how CPA viewed it.
Yeah, it would be interesting because it was part of the 2023 round that got approved. So we could ask to talk to them about like how have they set up their standards to include things like that, and why can't another city department have the same standard?
Right.
One thing that's on my mind that I'll just share before I forget, because I see this all the time. I saw it again today in a meeting with a developer. When we talk about what's there now and the cultural value that it has, or the architectural or historical value or whatever, we need to keep in mind that a tactic that developers use a lot is that they'll purchase a property and sit on it for 5 years, let it fall apart, let it sit vacant, and then claim it has no cultural or significance. There's nothing in here. It's like, okay, but let's look at it over the past several decades. It has for decades been a contributing to the neighborhood as a cultural asset. Just because the last few years that you've owned it, you haven't invested in it, doesn't mean that it didn't have cultural value before then. So I would want to make sure that any analysis takes the long view of what this resource has contributed or meant to the neighborhood over time, not just in its current condition, and versus what they're proposing. Are they proposing to have a local neighborhood business in it again or not? Are they if it's if you ever come out the backside of the Forest Hill station, there's like a dozen small storefronts all lined up, you know what I'm talking about? And I'm waiting any day. I'm gonna go there and they're gonna all be demolished, and it'll be one mega project with like 2 storefronts. And we're gonna lose not only the local businesses, but that walkability of that streetscape. So there's so much more that goes into it. I want to make sure we're being comprehensive in that. However, we're proposing to do that analysis at the very beginning of the Article 80 process, it has to take all of this into account because all of this has impacts on our neighborhoods.
Yeah, I'm going to give you a case study to look at, and I think I can even share the plans because I think they're already public. In Roslindale Square, there's a new project being proposed for, I think you can look it up by looking at 4200 Washington Street, I think. That is the set of kind of older, I don't know, kind of like 1920s, maybe even a little bit older style storefronts that face the square. And they have had wonderful businesses in them, like bakeries and shoe cobblers and things like that. Excuse me for one sec.
I think she's talking about Dragon Chef, that block that's being demolished.
Yes, so it just came across my desk for Article 85 today, and I immediately wrote to the planning team, and I was like, why are these being demolished? Why weren't they told to go above, like build above and keep those businesses in the place? And because we've already had a lot of like feedback on the demo of those buildings, stating just that like there will be so much culture lost if those kind of old-fashioned types of stores are lost. And sure enough, like when you look at the new plans, there is kind of street front storefronts, but they're not, you can tell it will be a CVS or a Walgreens or whatever. It's not going to be any of these kind of like charming older stores that have been there in the past. Anyway, that's just a case study where like but again, like proves our point, right? Like that project has been planned forever. And I am just now seeing an Article 85 application for it. So it's like a perfect case study for us to look at.
Exactly. So I live in Roslindale, and I commented on that a long time ago. Like this is a done deal. So the fact that it's going through Article 85 now, it's irrelevant. It's done.
Yeah.
They've already been through several iterations of designs. They're not going to start over. So I know we've only like a little bit of time left. We didn't quite get to Article 85, but we should talk about what our recommendations will be for Article 85, and how we want to formalize those comments.
I think I wrote to you and Amanda, and I'm sorry if I left off Lydia. I think I wrote like a very basic, like 3-step process. Meaning, first add some time to Article 85 as a stopgap, just so that in the until there's a citywide survey, we don't lose so much more building material. And then number 2 would be to actually get the city to institute a citywide survey, the type we are talking about, not just buildings and bricks and mortar. And then 2, in the end, like and step 3 in my little email was, when that's done, when a cohesive citywide survey is done and has an updating policy and all, when it's really fleshed out like other cities have, what do we do with Article 85? Like, do things still go through Article 85, or can it be abandoned, or is it something else? So I think those were sort of like my naive little steps to like walk Brian through and say, this is what we want to do. We need your support. And in the meantime, I've sort of been like delicately asking folks about citywide surveys, just to kind of garner some data so that we have some information to go on. So I don't need to be the person who structures this, but those were the 3 steps that I had sort of thought of.
Chelsea, I think it has been part of the conversation for a long time now that we do want to extend the delay to something more meaningful for Boston. So I do think that that's a good starting point. And we had talked about having conditions for reprieve within that. So let's say it's a 2-year delay, which people will really push back on. But if we say it's a 2-year delay, but if you do X, Y, Z, we lift the delay immediately. And that encourages people to participate in the process. For some projects, 2 years isn't even going to make that bigger difference if they do Article 85 right at the beginning. But anyway, I do think that's a good first step suggestion. To me, what it comes down to of whether or not we keep Article 85 is if we can get some of this put into Article 80, so that this review and analysis that we need is for all projects as part of Article 80 at the beginning of the process. And then if we do a study, a citywide survey, what are we doing with it? Because again, I can tell people that these buildings are historic and they're important, or these landscapes are important. If they have the zoning and they're allowed to build it, they're going to build it. They're going to do it anyway. So,
well, right. I think that's where we need to institute teeth into the survey. So
right.
I don't know if there's a, just pretend there's like a green light, yellow light, red light. Like whatever it is, 1, 2, 3, or a ABC. If you look at the survey and you see that a property has a red light on it, that means it can't be demolished. It is a significant building and it cannot be demolished. Maybe a yellow light means, preferably not demolished. And a green light means this can be demolished. I don't know what it looks like, but that survey has to have that type of teeth. Otherwise it's not useful.
Well, not useful to the extent that we want it to be useful. So that's what I often point to the Greater Ashmont Main Street, because they did that exactly that for their district. They sort of self-identified places. There's red, yellow, green with those exact categories. And I've been hoping we could do that citywide. I tried to get that in squares and streets and it didn't get anywhere, but the idea would be that the community would decide what places they wanted to keep or see changed or see go. But so we could do red, yellow, green. I think that's great. Other countries do grades, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, and there's different requirements based on the grade. So that's not unprecedented or unheard of. And why Boston or the United States has never done anything like that is ridiculous to me. So yeah, I agree. It has to have teeth. It has to have, I think that's going to be a really hard sell though, of like who gets to decide how we grade these or rank them. And then we're taking property rights away from somebody because now all of a sudden we've said you can't tear down your property that you thought you were going to redevelop. So that's going to be,
I mean, that is
battle.
going to happen. That it's inevitable. And that happens during Article 85 too. Right? So that's inevitable. I don't think we can avoid that type of like pushback. But you know, the benefit outweighs the cost, I guess.
That's what I mean. Other places do this. It's and with beautiful results. So I think we have the argument. We just have to be firm in making it.
Okay. So I think we have good next steps.
Yeah, we
So-
have a lot of writing to do.
yeah, a lot of reading. So I think if we have any final comments, we can open the floor up to that. Otherwise, you know, we can adjourn. So, final comments? No. All right, can I get a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Amazing. Okay, thank you guys.
Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Thank